Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 4 of Research Methods and Design. This week, we'll cover chapters 7 and 8 of the textbook. If you've seen so far, most weeks have a brief introductory video to chapters materials. Please be aware that those videos are not intended to replace the reading and studying. They are provided to get you started with study materials and to clarify or add something that I believe is useful for you in your attempt to comprehend the material. Let's now summarize Chapter 7, Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs. This chapter is planned to introduce you to the role of experimentation in the field of criminal justice. Research designs are a major way of controlling for invalidity in research. The language of research design is heavily couched in that of experimental designs. We now get into the thick of the course content by talking about experiments which are well suited for the controlled testing of causal processes and for some evaluation studies. They are suited for hypothesis testing but may also be appropriate for evaluation studies. The classical experiment tests the effect of an experimental stimulus on some dependent variable through the pre-testing and post-testing of experimental and controlled groups. It is less important that a group of experimental subjects be representative of some larger population, which we'll see in the sampling later on in this video, than that experimental and controlled groups be similar to each other. As for the pre and post test, subjects are initially measured in terms of the dependent variable prior to the association with the independent variable. This is the pre-tested stage. Then they are exposed to the independent variable, which is the treatment. Then they are remeasured in terms of the dependent variable. This is the post-tested stage. Differences noted between the measurements on the dependent variable are attributed to the influence of the independent variable. The experiment involves two groups: the experimental group exposed to whatever treatment, policy, or initiative we are testing, and the control group, very similar to experimental group, except that they are not exposed to the treatment or the independent variable. Oakley in 1998 states that the original meaning of the term control is check. The term comes from counter roll, a duplicate register made to verify an account. If we see a difference, we want to make sure it is due to the independent variable and not due to a difference between the two groups. For more, read the Hawthorne effect in the textbook. I want to explain the difference between the control group and the control variable because I see that students often confuse them. A control or controlling variable is one that the researcher uses to analyze the data and is any factor or variable that is controlled for or held constant during an experiment. Unlike the independent and dependent variables, controlled variables are not a part of the experiment. They are important because they could affect the outcome. For example, if you conducted an experiment examining the effect of a different incarceration method on recidivism, but you did not control for variables such as age, prior arrest, or say marital status of the respondents, then you wouldn't know if these other variables affected the outcome. So the control variables should be constant for all in order to claim that the effect was due to our treatment. Conversely, the control group is the sample of the incarcerated that was not applied the treatment, in our case, the different incarceration method. Random assignment is the best way to achieve comparability in the experimental and control group. The classical experiment with random assignment of subjects guards against most of the threats to internal validity. Experiments potentially control for many threats to the validity of causal inference, but researchers must remain aware of these threats. As we mentioned before, the central features of the classical experiment are independent and dependent variables, pre-testing and post-testing, and experimental and controlled group created through random assignment. The experimental design ensures that the cause precedes the effect in time by taking post-test measurements of the dependent variable after introducing the experimental stimulus. Cause and effect implies comparing pre-tests and post-tests to eliminate a possible influence of a third variable. Classical experiment makes this possible in two ways. Post-test measures for experimental group are compared with the control group, and two subjects are assigned randomly. The problem of internal validity threats refers to the possibility that conclusions drawn from experimental results may not accurately reflect what happened in the experiment itself. Last week, we said that conclusions about cause and effect may be biased. These threats are well known to researchers, but to students as well, not only for the course assignments, including the research paper, but also for the comprehensive exam and the thesis content. Let's discuss some of these threats. History. Historical events may occur during the course of the experiment that confound or muddle the experimental results. Maturation. People constantly are growing and changing, whether as a subject of an experiment or not. As people get older, their view or action related to crime may change, and that may represent a correlation that is not due to the predictor variable. Another threat is testing. Often, the process of testing and retesting may change the people's behavior. They may become more sensitive to the issue once faced with it before. Instrumentation is problematic, especially with secondary data, because of the possibility of different conceptualization and measurement. For example, different agencies may define and measure alcohol use in different ways. Statistical regression, commonly referred to as regression to the mean, this threat can emerge whenever researchers are interested in cases that have extreme scores on some variable. Consider hotspots, for example, which are areas where crime appears to be concentrated and have become increasingly important to the police. Over time, these may not be hotspots anymore because of the natural tendency to regress or go back to the mean crime rate. Selection biases refers to the way in which subjects are chosen. In order to avoid this threat, you must use random assignment of subjects. Experimental mortality. Subjects may drop out prior to completion of experiment for different reasons. Study the textbook for more information on some more threats to internal validity. Potential threats to internal validity are only some of the complications faced by experimenters. They are also having the problem of generalizing from experimental findings to the real world, because experiments often take place under controlled conditions. Here, I just want to talk briefly about threats to external validity. We need to answer questions like these. Can an intensive probation program, shown to be successful in Austin, Texas, achieve similar results in New York City? Threats to external validity are more significant for experiments conducted under carefully controlled conditions rather than more natural conditions. However, there is a conflict. Carefully controlled conditions actually reduce internal validity threat, which is a desired outcome. This is what John Eck described as a diabolical dilemma in 2002. A couple of suggestions to resolve this potential conflict are: explanatory studies should place greater emphasis on internal validity, while applied studies should be more concerned with external validity. However, remember that internal validity should be established before external validity becomes an issue. The classical experiment may be modified to suit specific research purposes by changing the number of experimental and control groups, the number and types of experimental stimuli, and the number of pre-test or post-test measurements. Quasi-experiments may be conducted when it is not possible or desirable to use an experimental design. Non-equivalent group and time series designs are two general types of quasi-experiments. About non-equivalent group designs, when we cannot randomize, we cannot assume equivalency, hence the name. Therefore, we take steps to make groups as comparable as possible by matching subjects in experimental and control group using important variables likely related to the dependent variable under study. Time series designs and case studies are examples of variable-oriented research, in which a large number of variables are examined for one or a few cases. Most known of time series studies are longitudinal studies, which examine a series of observations over time. Time series designs often use measures produced by criminal justice organizations. Let's now summarize Chapter 8, Sampling. This chapter introduces you to the manner in which people or things are selected from a population for study when the population as a whole is either too difficult or unnecessary to include. The logic of probability sampling is that small subsets can represent the whole population. The chief criterion of a sample's quality is the degree to which it is representative, the extent to which these characteristics of the sample are the same as those of the population from which it was selected. Samples should be unbiased. However, some degree of sampling error always exists. Probability sampling methods provide one excellent way of selecting samples that will be quite representative. They also make it possible to estimate the amount of sampling error that should be expected in a given sample. The main principle of probability sampling is that every member of the total population must have a probability of being selected into the sample. Let's talk about the sampling distribution. A sample element is that unit about which information is collected and that provides the basis of analysis. Typically, in survey research, elements are people, but can also be other kinds, such as correctional facilities, gangs, police beats, or court cases. Population is made of all people, things, or other elements we wish to represent. Researchers often study only a subset or a sample of a population and then infer from the sample to the larger population of all people, things, or elements. Estimating population parameters with sample statistics is rooted in the sampling distribution and probability theory. Sample statistic is the summary description of a particular variable in a sample. For example, if the mean age of a sample of 100 professors at John Jay is 41.1, then 41.1 is the sample statistic for professor's age. We usually use sample statistics to estimate population parameter. If we took all the professors at John Jay College and found the mean age to be 45 years old, then that would be the population parameter. So the parameter is the population value and statistic is the sample value of interest. If we draw a large number of samples of a given size, sample statistics will cluster around the true population parameter. Sampling distribution is the range or array of sample statistics we would obtain if we drew a very large number of samples from a single population. With random sampling, we expect that the sampling distribution for a particular statistic, mean age for example, will cluster around the population parameter for mean age. I have created a podcast where I explain sampling distribution in detail, which can be found in this week's material. Confidence level is the estimated probability that a population parameter lies within a given confidence interval. Thus, we might be 90% confident that between 35 and 45% of all residents of California favor an absolute ban on handguns. Confidence interval, on the other hand, is the range of values within which a population parameter is estimated to lie. Note that it is necessary to specify a confidence level in connection with every confidence interval. We will learn more about this in Chapter 14 and, of course, in CRJ 716. Let's talk now about different methods of sampling. Key feature to all probability sampling designs is the relationship between populations and sampling frames. A sampling frame is the quasi-list of elements from which a probability sample is selected. First, simple random sampling is logically the most fundamental technique in probability sampling, although it is seldom used in practice. Each element in a sampling frame is assigned a number. Choices are then made through random number generation as to which elements will be included in our sample. Systematic sampling involves using a sampling frame to select units that appear at some specified interval. Elements in the total list are chosen systematically for inclusion in the sample. This method is functionally equivalent to simple random sampling. Say that you have a list of 1,000 elements. We want a sample of 333. Therefore, you select every third element in the sampling frame. This method involves choosing the first element randomly. However, a periodic arrangement of elements in the list can make systematic sampling unwise. Stratification improves the degree of representativeness of a sample by reducing the sampling error. It ensures that appropriate numbers are drawn from homogeneous subset of that population. Disproportionate stratified sampling is especially useful when we want to select adequate numbers of certain types of subjects who are relatively rare in the population we are studying. Cluster sampling is a multi-stage sampling method in which elements are selected in 2 or more stages, with the first stage being the random selection of naturally occurring clusters and the last stage being the random selection of elements within clusters. This is often used to study large populations, such as city blocks, police or correctional departments, etc. For example, the NCVS and BCS British Crime Survey are national crime surveys based on multi-stage cluster samples. Non-probability sampling is the procedure in which a sample is selected in some fashion other than those suggested by probability theory. Some examples are purposive sampling, where you select the units to be observed based on your own judgment about which ones will be best suited to your research purpose. Most television networks use purposive sampling to voting precincts to project winning candidates on election night. Precincts that always vote for winners are sampled. Quota sampling, where units are selected based on pre-specified characteristics so that the total sample will have the same distribution of characteristics as are assumed to exist in the population being studied. Snowball sampling, often used in field research, where each person interviewed is asked to suggest additional people for interviewing. For this week, make sure to complete the midterm exam by the end of the week. Since the midterm has 80 questions, there will be no weekly exams and no discussion board for this week. Before you attempt the midterm, make sure to read chapters 7 and 8 and reread all the chapters that we've covered so far. Have a great week, everyone, and good luck on the midterm exam.